My name is Mia and I am 27 years old. For years, I lived under the crushing weight of being the successful one, the daughter whose only job was to be a safety net for everyone else's failures. But the morning I stood on the balcony of my new lakefront villa in Portland, I thought I had finally bought my freedom. I was wrong. The peace lasted exactly 3 days before the first vibration of my phone shattered it. It wasn't a casual check-in. It was a summons appearing in the family group chat. My sister casually texted Mia tomorrow, "I'm moving into your lakefront villa. The kids need more space." I stood there frozen as that message popped up, but the true cruelty lay in my parents' immediate reaction. My father added, "If you don't like it, you can find somewhere else to live." My mother instantly dropped a heart emoji and followed up with, "You have to be responsible for the family." They didn't even ask for my opinion. They were announcing a hostile takeover of the property I worked my life away to own. But what they don't know is that I've already prepared a surprise for her when she arrives. Welcome to the Calm Life Stories. I'm standing in my garden today, watching the leaves rustle in the wind and wondering, is family truly a peaceful sanctuary, or just a debt trap with no escape under the guise of kinship? Subscribe now to see how I perform a brutal audit to protect the home that belongs only to me. I stepped away from the glass railing of the balcony, the chilly evening air of Portland, suddenly feeling like an intrusive weight against my skin. This villa was supposed to be my fortress of solitude, a tangible reward for the relentless 80-hour work weeks I had endured at the bank. But staring at that group chat, I realized it had merely become a larger target for the predators I called family. For 5 years, I had operated under the delusion that if I just paid enough, I could buy a version of peace that didn't involve my ribs feeling like they were being crushed by invisible hands. I sat down at my mahogany desk, the silence of the house amplified by the echo of my own heartbeat as memories of the family subscription plan began to resurface. It had started almost immediately after my first major promotion. My sister Maren, a single mother who had perfected the art of the trembling lower lip, had cornered me during a Thanksgiving dinner. She didn't ask for a loan, she presented a tragedy. She claimed our 8-year-old daughter Lulu had suffered a severe fall at the park, resulting in a compound fracture. Maren stood in the kitchen clutching a dish towel as if it were a rosary, sobbing about high deductibles and the cruelty of the American healthcare system. I didn't even hesitate. I sent $4,000 that same night, fueled by a primal need to protect my niece. I later found out that the emergency surgery was actually a minor sprain, but by then, the precedent had been set. The emergencies became a monthly cadence, a scripted drama where Lulu's health was always the bargaining chip. There was the rare allergy scare that supposedly required a specialized treatment center in California, an ordeal that cost me another $7,000. Then came the tuition shortfall for the private academy Maren insisted Lulu attend to escape the trauma of their neighborhood. Every time my phone buzzed with Maren's name, my stomach would tighten into a jagged knot. It wasn't just her voice. It was the inevitable follow-up from our parents, Louis and John. Lulu would call me with a heavy sigh, the kind that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken disappointments. "Mia, your sister is drowning," he would say, his voice flat and weary. "You have so much, and she has so little. Do you really want your niece to suffer because you're holding on to a few extra zeros in your savings account?" He made my financial stability feel like a moral failing, a selfish hoarding of resources that belonged to the collective. Jean was more surgical in her approach, using guilt like a scalpel. She would remind me of how they sacrificed their youth so I could get my degree, subtly implying that my current salary was a communal pot that I was merely the custodian of. Family helps each other without asking why, Mia. That is what it means to be a daughter. Under this relentless pincer movement of guilt and manufactured crisis, I became the family's personal ATM. I was a risk assessment expert who ignored every red flag because the cost of saying no was a week-long silent treatment or being labeled the cold-hearted bank robot during Sunday brunch. Over $60,000, that was the staggering total I had bled out over 60 months. I had been paying for a seat at a table where I was only invited when the check was due. I looked around my quiet office, the expensive minimalist decor suddenly feeling like a hollow victory. I had spent $60,000 to buy a silence that never lasted, a peace that was always one emergency away from being shattered. I realized then that Maren didn't see me as a sister. She saw me as a high-yield investment that she was entitled to liquidate whenever her lifestyle exceeded her means. My compassion had been a luxury they had been overdrafting for half a decade, and as I looked at the dark water of the lake outside, I felt the bank finally closing its doors. The blue light of my laptop screen reflected in my eyes like a cold digital sunrise illuminating the wreckage of a trust I had spent a lifetime trying to preserve. I had reached a point where Maren's tears no longer registered as human emotion. To me, they had become nothing more than suspicious data points in a failing investment. As a risk management expert, my job was to spot the anomalies that others missed, and tonight I was finally turning that lens on my own family. I began to scroll through the archive of emergency photos Maren had sent me over the years, images that had once prompted me to empty my savings without a second thought. Now, with the emotional blinders removed, the cracks in her narrative were so glaring it was almost insulting. I pulled up the photo from the compound fracture incident that had cost me $4,000. At the time, I was so blinded by panic for Lulu that I hadn't looked at the background. Now I zoomed in on the pristine white wall behind my niece's bed. There were no hospital monitors, no call buttons, and no sterile linoleum flooring. It was just a plain drywall corner that looked suspiciously like the guest bedroom in Maren's old apartment. I moved on to the digital copies of the medical invoices she had messaged me for the specialized allergy treatment. My fingers hovered over the touchpad as I noticed the jagged edges of the text. The font for the total amount, $7,000, was slightly heavier than the rest of the document, a classic sign of a poorly executed PDF edit. The hospital's logo in the corner was pixelated, a low-resolution clip art image pasted over what was likely a routine checkup bill. The realization that I had been subsidizing a lifestyle of deception felt like a physical chill, but I needed more than just visual suspicion. I needed a forensic confirmation. I reached out to Nathan Brooks, a former college classmate who now worked as a senior administrator at Portland General Hospital. We hadn't spoken in months, but he was the only person I trusted to navigate the bureaucratic red tape without asking questions that would alert our parents. I sent him the invoice numbers Maren had provided, claiming I was reconciling some tax documents for a family trust. The wait for his reply felt like sitting in a courtroom before a verdict is read. When my phone finally chimed with his email, the truth didn't just arrive. It exploded. Mia, I checked these codes against our central database. Nathan's message began, his clinical tone offering no comfort. None of these invoice numbers exist in our system. Furthermore, the procedure listed for the allergy treatment isn't a specialized surgery. It's a standard over-the-counter diagnostic test that costs less than $100. He went on to clarify that while Lulu had indeed been seen for a minor sprain 3 years ago, the total bill had been covered by a state-funded program for single parents. There was no high deductible. There was no emergency surgery. Maren hadn't been drowning in medical debt. She had been drowning in greed. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the lake house now feeling heavy with the weight of this betrayal. While I was skipping vacations and working until my eyes burned to provide for my niece's survival, Maren was using my labor to fund a hidden life of luxury. I cross-referenced the dates of my largest transfers with her social media archives from that period. I found a close friend's story she had forgotten to hide, showing her at a high-end medical spa on the same day I sent $7,000 for Lulu's life-saving medication. She was laughing in the video, toasted a glass of champagne to the camera while wearing a designer robe. It was a systematic harvest of my empathy. Maren had identified my greatest weakness, my love for Lulu, and turned it into a weapon to extract my wealth. She wasn't just a sister who had made a mistake. She was a predator who had spent years grooming her mark. My parents, Louis and Jean, had been the unwitting accomplices, their constant pressure serving as the enforcement arm of Maren's long con. I realized then that my subscription to Family Peace had actually been a direct investment in my sister's fraud. The ledger was clear, the audit was complete, and the bank was not just closed, it was preparing for a hostile takeover of its own. The digital trail of Maren's medical lies was a heavy enough burden to bear, but as a risk manager, I knew that a predator who had tasted blood would never stop at small-scale scavenging. I sat in the darkness of my Portland villa, the only light coming from the flickering notification icon on my professional credit monitoring dashboard. It was a crimson alert, a jagged drop in my credit score that felt like a sudden plunge into ice water. My perfect rating, a fortress I had meticulously built since my first internship, had been breached. I clicked on the detailed report, my fingers cold against the keyboard, and watched as the full scale of the betrayal unspooled across the screen. There it was, buried under a series of routine inquiries, a business loan for $120,000. The blood drained from my face as I read the fine print. I was listed as the primary co-signer for a venture called Maren's Luxe Boutique. The loan had been originated 6 months ago during the very week I was in London for the International Banking Summit. I remembered that week vividly. I was working 18-hour days in a secure facility in Canary Wharf, thousands of miles away from any notary's office in Oregon. I scrolled down to the digital copy of the application, and there it was, my signature. It was a practiced, chilling imitation of my handwriting, scrolled with an arrogance that suggested she never thought I would look close enough to notice. This wasn't just another plea for emergency cash, or a medical bill meant to tug at my heartstrings. This was a calculated felony. This was identity theft on a scale that could dismantle my entire career. I leaned back, the high-back leather chair offering no support for the hollow feeling in my chest. I realized exactly how she had done it. Last Christmas, Louis and Jean had insisted I leave my briefcase in the home office while we had dinner, claiming they wanted a work-free zone for the holidays. I had trusted them. I had left my sensitive documents, including my secondary passport and social security card, in what I thought was the safest place on earth. Maren must have slipped away while I was helping Jean in the kitchen, photographing every piece of my life like a spy behind enemy lines. She hadn't just been looking for a place to stay. She had been running from the wreckage of a financial house of cards she had built using my name as the foundation. $120,000. The sheer magnitude of the debt made my breath hitch. She had used my perfect credit score as her personal collateral, betting that my loyalty as a sister would prevent me from ever reporting the crime once I found out. She knew that in my world, a fraud conviction for a family member was a stain that never quite washed out, and she was counting on my shame to keep me silent. But as I stared at the forged signature, I didn't feel shame. I felt a cold, surgical clarity. Maren hadn't just stolen my money, she had attempted to steal my future. She had gambled with my professional reputation to fund a boutique dream that was likely nothing more than a front for her spiraling lifestyle. The betrayal of Louis and Jean hit me with a secondary wave of nausea. Did they know? Had they stood guard at the office door while Maren raided my files? Louis's constant refrains about family responsibility, and Jean's heart emojis suddenly felt like the tactical distractions of a well-coordinated heist. They had groomed me to be the provider so that they could facilitate Maren's parasitic existence without consequence. By making me the successful one, they had unwittingly marked me as the primary target for liquidation. I realized that my sister wasn't just moving in because Lulu needed more space. She was moving in because the bank was beginning to knock on her door, and she needed to be close enough to the source of her stolen wealth to keep the illusion alive. I downloaded the entire loan application, saving it into a folder I encrypted with triple-layer security. I titled it, Evidence: The Hostile Takeover. This was the kill shot. In litigation and risk management, there is always one piece of evidence that makes the entire defense collapse, and Maren had just handed it to me on a silver platter. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was a witness to a federal crime. I looked out at the moon reflecting on the lake, the stillness of the water a stark contrast to the predatory chaos my family was bringing to my doorstep. Maren thought she was moving into a lakefront sanctuary. She didn't realize she was walking into a courtroom where I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The bank was officially closed, and the audit was about to become a prosecution. I watched my phone screen light up with a relentless barrage of notifications, a digital storm of entitlement and rage that would have once sent me into a spiral of panic. Not tonight. I had entered the cold, clinical headspace of a financial auditor dealing with a fraudulent entity. I was implementing the gray rock method, a psychological fortress, where I made myself as uninteresting and unresponsive as a plain gray pebble. Maren sent a string of texts calling me a selfish monster for not sharing my lakefront villa, while Louis and Jean took turns lecturing me on the sanctity of the family bond. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't even read the full messages. I simply let the noise exist in a vacuum, starving them of the emotional fuel they so desperately craved to justify their invasion. Silence was the only language a narcissist couldn't manipulate, and I was about to give them a life sentence of it. While they were busy drafting their next emotional attacks, I was busy drafting the blueprints for their downfall. I sat at my printer, the rhythmic hum of the machine acting as a soothing contrast to the chaos brewing in the family group chat. I wasn't preparing a guest room, I was preparing a prosecution. I assembled 3 distinct white folders, each one a nail in the coffin of Maren's predatory lifestyle. The first folder contained a formal itemization of the $60,000 I had transferred over the last 5 years. I included every bank confirmation, every emergency text message that prompted the transfer, and a notarized affidavit stating these were loans obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. It was an accounting of a debt that was no longer a request but a legal obligation. The second folder was the heaviest both in weight and in consequence. This was the dossier on the $120,000 business loan. I had printed the forged signature next to my actual passport signature, a side-by-side comparison that made the felony impossible to deny. I included my travel records from London, my hotel receipts, and a letter from my employer confirming my presence in a high-security facility on the day the loan was notarized. This wasn't just evidence for a family argument. This was a criminal referral packet ready for the district attorney. Maren thought she had used my credit to buy a boutique dream, but she had actually used it to buy a one-way ticket to a federal investigation. The third folder contained the visual evidence Nathan Brooks had helped me verify. I had printed out the pixelated hospital invoices next to the actual standard diagnostic forms from Portland General Hospital. I highlighted the mismatched fonts and the lack of official logos. Next to these, I placed the screenshots of Maren's medical spa visits, her designer robes, and her champagne toasts, all time-stamped to match the days she claimed Lulu was fighting for her life. This folder was the moral audit, the proof that she had weaponized her own daughter's health to fund her vanity. It was the evidence that would strip away the struggling single mother mask she wore so well in front of our parents. I looked at the 3 folders sitting on my desk, their clean white surfaces hiding the rot of a decade-long betrayal. In my old life, I might have considered a rental agreement a way to let them stay while they paid me back. But that Madison was gone. I didn't want their money, and I certainly didn't want their presence polluting the air of the home I had built. I wanted them gone permanently. I wasn't a daughter or a sister anymore. I was the primary creditor of a bankrupt family, and I was here to seize the assets of my own peace. I felt a strange sense of power as I tucked the folders into a leather briefcase. For the first time in 27 years, the ground under my feet was mine, and I wasn't going to let a single suitcase touch my floors. I spent the rest of the night setting up the final layers of my defense. I activated the high-definition perimeter cameras and ensured the gate security codes were reset. I didn't feel anger, nor did I feel the crushing pressure in my ribs that had defined my relationship with Maren for so long. There was only a quiet, crystalline focus. I was a risk manager who had finally identified the greatest threat to my survival, and I was moving to neutralize it with lethal precision. As the first light of dawn began to touch the surface of the lake, I sat by the window and waited. Maren thought she was moving into a sanctuary, but she was actually arriving at a crime scene where she was the lead suspect. The sharp crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires announced their arrival at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. I stood in the shadows of my upstairs balcony looking down through the tinted glass as an oversized black SUV pulled into the driveway of my Portland villa. Maren stepped out first wearing a pair of expensive sunglasses and an expression of predatory triumph that suggested she had already redecorated the place in her mind. She wasn't alone. She had brought two of her friends along, likely to act as a captive audience for her big move. And Lulu followed behind, dragging a small pink suitcase. Maren was laughing, gesturing grandly toward the cedar siding and the expansive lake view as if she were a tour guide showing off her new estate. She had spent the last 48 hours telling everyone who would listen that I had finally seen reason and invited her to stay. She was walking toward my front gate with the unearned confidence of an invading general who believed the city had already surrendered. When she reached the wrought iron gate and found it locked, her laughter died an abrupt, ugly death. She punched the security code, the old one I had shared for a weekend visit months ago, and a harsh red light flashed as the system rejected it. I watched her face contort from confusion to a familiar, jagged rage. She began to rattle the bars, her voice rising in a shrill cadence that echoed across the water. "Mia, open this gate right now. We have been driving for 3 hours and Lulu is exhausted. Stop playing these pathetic games." Her friends stood back, shifting uncomfortably as the warm family welcome they had been promised devolved into a public spectacle. Maren pulled out her phone, and within seconds my own device began to vibrate with a FaceTime request from Louis and Jean. I answered the call but didn't show my face. I simply pointed the camera toward the gate where Maren was now screaming at the intercom. Louis's face appeared on the screen, his forehead creased with a performative anger that no longer had any power over me. "Mia, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "Your sister is standing out in the heat with your niece. Have you completely lost your mind? Open that gate and let them in this instant. We did not raise a daughter to be this cruel to her own blood." Jean was visible in the background, her eyes red as she wailed about family unity and how I was breaking her heart. They were still using the same old script, expecting me to play the role of the guilty, compliant daughter who would prioritize their comfort over her own survival. I ended the call without a single word of explanation and stepped out onto the balcony, the 3 white folders gripped firmly in my hand. The sight of me caused Maren to freeze, her mouth hanging open as she prepared another insult. I didn't give her the chance to speak. I leaned over the railing, my voice amplified by the quiet stillness of the lake. "You are not coming in, Maren." I said, my tone as flat and clinical as a court reporter's. "Not today, not tomorrow, and not ever. This isn't a family reunion, it's an eviction of a ghost. You told everyone I invited you. That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming I was still the person you could rob in broad daylight." I walked down the exterior stairs and approached the gate, stopping just inches from the bars. Maren reached through, trying to grab my arm, but I stepped back and slid the folders through the gap, letting them hit the pavement at her feet. Inside those folders is the audit of your life, Maren. I continued, watching as her friends leaned in to see. The first one is the $60,000 you stole through medical lies. The second is the forensic evidence of the $120,000 business loan you forged my signature for. I've already sent a digital copy to the bank's fraud department and the local precinct. If you aren't off my property and out of this driveway in 5 minutes, the next person you'll be talking to won't be your mean sister. It will be a Portland police officer with a warrant for identity theft. The color drained from Maren's face so rapidly it was almost cinematic. She looked down at the folders, then at her friends, whose expressions had shifted from curiosity to absolute horror. The struggling mother mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She tried to scream that I was lying, that the documents were fakes, but her voice lacked its usual manipulative strength. She knew I was a risk manager. She knew I didn't make threats I couldn't back up with cold, hard data. Lulu started to cry, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, but Maren didn't comfort her. She was too busy staring at the folder that detailed the $120,000 felony. She realized then that the successful sister she had spent years liquidating had finally turned into the one person who could put her in a cage. Without another word, she scrambled to pick up the papers, shoved Lulu back into the SUV, and sped away the tires, throwing gravel against the gate, as the black shadow of her greed finally retreated from my home. The sound of Maren's tires grinding against the gravel faded into a hollow silence, leaving nothing behind but the scent of exhaust and the heavy stillness of the Portland mist. I didn't watch her drive away until she was out of sight. I simply turned my back on the gate and walked toward the sanctuary of my villa. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation began to ebb, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. I went straight to my office and sat at the desk that had seen the birth of my career and the audit of my family's betrayal. There was one final button to push, one last digital barrier to erect between my life and the predators who shared my blood. I opened my laptop and officially filed the identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission and the major credit bureaus, attaching the mountain of forensic evidence I had painstakingly gathered. The host-subsidiary relationship was officially terminated. In the weeks that followed, the fallout of my audit hit Maren with the force of a tidal wave. Because I had filed a formal police report for identity theft, the bank was legally obligated to freeze the fraudulent business loan. They didn't just stop the credit line, they initiated a full internal investigation into the Maren's Luxe boutique venture. Since the collateral for the $120,000 was non-existent and the signature was forged, the bank moved to mitigate their losses immediately. Maren was forced to sell the luxury SUV I had helped fund and her designer wardrobe just to keep the debt collectors at bay. Her credit score, once inflated by my perfect history, plummeted into the dark abyss of subprime, making it impossible for her to secure even a basic apartment lease. She was facing a civil lawsuit that would garnish her wages for decades, a permanent financial scar for a woman who believed she was entitled to a life she hadn't earned. The reaction from Louis and Jean was as scripted as I expected. They attempted to call me dozens of times, their voicemails shifting from outraged demands for family loyalty to pathetic pleas for me to drop the charges. They claimed Maren was on the verge of homelessness and that Lulu was the one suffering for my bitterness. I listened to one last message from Louis, his voice trembling as he called me a cold-blooded stranger, before I blocked their numbers permanently. I realized then that they weren't mourning the loss of a daughter. They were mourning the loss of a primary financier. To them, the family bond was a contract where I provided the resources, and they provided the guilt. By cutting the cord, I hadn't just saved my money, I had saved my sanity. I stood on the deck of my villa as the sun began to dip behind the pines, casting long golden shadows across the surface of the lake. The peace I felt wasn't loud or triumphant, It was the quiet, steady strength of a person who had finally learned to breathe without permission. I thought about the $60,000 I would likely never see again, and the $120,000 debt that was no longer my burden to carry. Those numbers were no longer the measure of my worth. They were the cost of my tuition in the school of hard boundaries. I had paid a high price for my freedom, but as I looked at the dark, unbothered blue of the water, I knew it was the best investment I had ever made. Looking back on this journey, I have realized a truth that most of us are too afraid to admit until it is almost too late. We are often taught that family is an unconditional contract, a bond that justifies any amount of self-sacrifice or silence in the face of abuse. But I have learned that love without respect is nothing more than control, wearing a kinder mask. If you find yourself in a situation where your peace is treated like a commodity and your labor is treated like a communal pot, remember that you are allowed to perform an audit on your own life. You are allowed to count the cost of your loyalty and decide that the price is too high. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a requirement for your healing, especially when the person asking for it is still holding the knife. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to be cold, clinical, and absolutely final. Boundary setting isn't meant to punish others. It is meant to protect the version of you that finally learned how to say no. I didn't get an apology and I didn't get my money back, but I got my future. I learned that no is a complete sentence and that your peace is worth every bit of their discomfort. If you are standing at your own send button today, trembling and afraid, just know that the stillness on the other side is worth every bit of the struggle.